Hello, everyone, and welcome to this developer review. I'm Espen, and I am a principal engineer on the studio team at Sanity. And I've been here for, 6 years? So a lot of the things that we will be presenting today is something that I'm very happy to show off. A lot of modernizing and improvements to a product that's been, that we're very, very, very happy with. So let's get into it. What is the new things in version 3? To sort of spoil the surprise a little bit, the main focus is an improved developer experience. That doesn't mean it's just developer experience. There's also a bunch of new possibilities and flexibility that's provided through these things. So let's take a look. What we set out to achieve with these improvements were to have a faster development flow, a better documentation, easier versioning of Sanity, and that you would write less code as a third-party developer, someone that's using Sanity. And we wanted to feel more basically familiar. If you're used to the React ecosystem or the JavaScript ecosystem, it should feel more familiar to you. So not too specifically Sanity-isms. So one of the things that we've done in that regards is to modernize our tooling. And that means we have a new and faster development server, which is based on Vite. So it has a lot faster hot reloads when you're editing schemas and code. It also has much better tree shaking, dynamic imports, things like that. And it also supports the full range of ECMAScript syntax in the latest versions of that. So that's great. And we're really excited about also bringing full TypeScript support to the studio. So that means that our entire code base is, well, it's mostly written in TypeScript, and the rest of it will be by the time we launch. And that means all the new and old APIs, they have proper typings, so you'll have that auto completion in your editor. We have typed schema definitions, so you'll have much easier time authoring schemas and seeing if there's any errors in there while you're authoring them. And we will also have inline documentation for all the methods and types. So it should be amazing when you're using these within your editor to also have that kind of documentations alongside the code. We're also aligning it with modern JavaScript, as I talked about. Part of that is part of that process was getting rid of what we call the parts system. Which was a custom extension and plugin system that we built a long time ago, which unfortunately does not play very well with modern and custom tooling. And so we knew that if we wanted to support the current state of JavaScript and whatever comes in the future, we had to replace that with something that is more in line with the ecosystem already. So that means in version 3 of Sanity is actually just JavaScript. That we use just regular JavaScript to provide plugins and to configure the studio, which enables things like TypeScript and custom bundlers, like whatever bundler you want to use. And you can have linters and anything that you might want to use in your Sanity system or Sanity project. And that also means that Sanity version 3 is just a JavaScript or React framework. And that means you can use it in any browser, any bundler, any Node.js context that you want. The configuration is also a lot more flexible, as we'll get back to. And we'll also have some really cool example that showcases some of this flexibility, and that'll be later in this event. But to give you the highlight, it's kind of like configuring just a React component. Because that's basically what it is. So you can do things like this, where you import the studio from our Sanity package and then pass it a configuration, and then it will basically render. We've of course taken steps to make this a little bit easier. In the most cases, you don't necessarily need to provide the rendering yourself. There's still a configuration file to get you started and get your studio up and running. So in terms of the configuration, you can either pass props to React component, as I just showed, but we also have a config file. There's no sanity.json file anymore. It's now JavaScript or TypeScript, if you prefer, which means you can get auto completion for that configuration. You can use things like environment variables or URL state or whatever else you want to come up with. So things like making a single studio that changes its or loads its configuration based on the host name and where it's hosted, for instance, is possible now. And we also align better in terms of TypeScript, making it easier to know what is available. So when you're creating these configs, you'll get the auto-completion in your editor, and plugins can hook into and provide a lot of these things. So you can provide schema types, input components, all the things that you can configure is now part of that plugin possibility. And a lot of these properties are also conditional, which means you can sort of base that configuration on which user is currently logged in. So that provides like a wealth of flexibility in terms of if you want parts of the studio to act a little bit differently based on what the user's role is, you can shape that. And we also sort of aligned the context that's available so that they feel this more familiar and more the same across the studio and the different API surfaces. And we've also made the distribution easier. We just now moved to a single package called Sanity. So instead of having these very individual small pieces like Sanity Base, Desk Tool, Default Layout, it's mostly just one package that's called Sanity, which makes it really easy to upgrade because you just upgrade that version number of that module and it's up to date. And it's also really easy to answer the question of which version of Sanity are you on, which helps our support team a lot as well. Yeah, pass it off to Bjørge.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Bjørge and I'm a senior front-end developer on the studio team, and I'm going to talk about the changes to the form APIs that we have been working on for version 3 of the studio. So if you could take the next slide. Yeah. So what's been our main focus with forms in V3? That's been better composability and customizability. So in V2, in order to make a custom array input, it was super hard. It was borderline impossible, I'd say, at least without copying in the source code from our public repo. And that also gave you a lot of code with a lot of like internal things that it was kind of hard to figure out. Also in V2, to begin with, to make a custom object input was quite straightforward, but it became increasingly difficult as we added features to kind of the default object input. So in short, the approach that we had here was not very sustainable, and it caused maintenance headaches both for us and studio developers. So I'm happy to say that in V3 we have solved the hard parts for you up front. So just as an example of what you would have to really think about in version 2 was if you wanted a object input that supported conditional fields, which was a feature we added, I think, a year and a half ago. Then you had some rather complicated things to figure out on your own. So as an example of that, first of all, you had to get hold of all the parameters that conditional field callbacks needed. Conditional fields can be defined using a callback, and that callback function takes a set of arguments. And if you were to support conditional fields, you had to kind of figure out where to get all those parameters from. There's also some rather tricky cases, there's an object, all of the conditional callbacks happens to return to say that the field should be hidden. So that would make you end up with an empty object, and obviously you don't want to render that empty object. Like that would show just like a title and a description and nothing else. And also maybe that object is a field on another object, and all the other fields in that object again also are also hidden. So that means the parent of this also needs to be hidden. So these are kind of like surprises that you would get if you try to implement this on your own. But I'm happy to say that in V3, you really don't need to worry about any of this. So if you make a custom object input, you will get a readily prepared data structure that reflects the result of all the conditional field callbacks. So we call the conditional callbacks for you, and then we pass you the result of that. And if a field is supposed to be hidden, you won't even see it. So in that sense, we do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Yeah. There's also some improvements to the array input. So I think there's, like, in short, the really hard parts in V2 has been to create custom array or object inputs that inputs that deals with array structures or object structures. In V3, that's been vastly improved. So for example, if you make an array input, you now get passed the props that you can use to manipulate that array. So for example, if you just want to append an item to the array, you have a function that you can basically pass. You can call it with the item that you want to add. You can also move an item easily. If you want to support draggable, sortable arrays, then you have a callback that you can use for that. Yeah. So we have also added a couple of view-agnostic helper components. So in V2, if you wanted to use the default studio object input, you would get it with a predetermined layout. So that will be basically what the form look like, where every field comes down one after another in a vertical layout. But that's kind of constraining you in a way. Like, it's like, what if you want a tabular layout, or what if you want to lay out the fields in some other way? So in V3, we have the object input is the default object input is more or less headless, and that means it comes with very little view-specific code. That also makes it a lot easier to import in your own studio and wrap it, and you can then customize things like how the fields are laid out. So we also added, improved the composability of form inputs with render callbacks. And the question here was whether we wanted to use render callbacks or components that took a set of props. Render callbacks have some advantages. First of all, they're highly composable. They're just functions. You can combine them in all the ways you want. It works. A render callback works well with use callback. But the biggest advantage, in my opinion, is that you can use values from the parent scope. Like if you want to render an object input and you have a value inside your component, that value can be used inside the render callback. So in this code example here, one of the callbacks are called render input, and you can customize that, and you can use values from inside your component in that customization. Yeah, so there's a better separation of concerns. Before V3, we had this divide, or no, we didn't have it. We had this, like, the concept of an input component, where did include like the title and the description, so it was more like a field. But a field is kind of specific to objects. For example, if you have an array with items, you don't really have a field. So that terminology didn't make all that much sense in an array context. So in V3, we split input and field. They're two different concepts. And that makes it possible to reuse and kind of use just the input aspect in isolation without getting the field thing around it. So, and that makes it a lot more flexible. You can, of course, wrap it with a field if you want, and you can still use the field in context where it makes sense. But you have also the ability to get just the input part of the component. So for objects, it's fields, and for arrays, it's items. So, and the preview is also a separate thing, and also the diff components that show like how the difference between two values basically. It's yeah. So here's an example that shows how little it takes to use the default, or this is the helper component. So it's called array of object members, and it basically takes a list of, it takes the same props as an array input, but you can use it to merely iterate over each value and render them separately. So this will show the input in a grid without any fields around them. You also have a separate function if you want to actually have the fields here. Yeah, and there's a couple of other highlights. The modal and dialogue management have been improved. So if you have a custom input and you want to show a dialogue or show a model in there, you have a callback that you can call to kind of set that state, and that will be handled by us. And you don't really need to use any local state. You can just call that function, and that will come back to you as a Boolean saying whether the dialogue should be open or not. The same goes for collapsible state management. That's fields can be collapsible. And another thing is that the image and file input now supports field sets. So you can now define you can group fields for the array. No, sorry, for the image and file input into field sets. And we've done some improvements in error handling in various cases where data doesn't match what the schema says it should match. So this is very excited about this, and I'm very happy, or very looking forward to get feedback on this.
Hey, hello everybody. I am Marius Lundgaard, and I'm a product designer at Sanity. And I'm one of those product designers who codes. So I've been involved with this whole project, and really happy to show everybody what we have been doing. So yeah, developer experience is like really important to us. So we sort of try to work on that in a design-oriented way as well. But anyway, here's a little new feature called workspaces. It's actually not entirely new. We had something called experimental spaces before. Experimental spaces was a way to switch the data set in a studio. So you could have a development and a staging and a production data set, for example. But we were never super happy with how we did that. That's why it was called experimental as well. But yeah, this new feature is first-class citizen that everything in the studio is based on top of. So every studio has at least one workspace, basically. And then you have this UI for switching between workspaces. So Also, when you go to the login page for a studio, you can select like which workspace do you want to log into. You can have multiple projects, so you can log into studios that are connected to like multiple Sanity projects. So, for example, if you're working with another company and they have a studio as well, you can add their studio as a convenience into the same studio as you are working in. So yeah, the really cool thing about this is that you can configure an icon and a logo and a theme and different schemas for the different workspaces. So when you swap, you will see like the themes changing and the tools changing. And yeah, we're really happy with how this works. Also there's some utility hooks and APIs, so you can make features on top of workspaces as well by using use workspace and use workspaces. So yeah, really curious to hear what people think about this, and please give us feedback. Yeah, this is a sort of general change that we have done in V3. So V3 or V2 was made many years ago. I think the work started around 2016 or something. So some of the code base has been there for a long time, and we used older React patterns before. So it was things like class-based React contexts and higher order components to get a hold of the context value. But we have now migrated to modern React contexts and hooks. So it's less higher order components and hooks, and I think hooks is a really nice addition to the React ecosystem. So we have based the changes on that. Yeah, here's just a little example to show you some of the hooks. So for example, use current user, that I think was an old hook as well, but it's now sort of properly integrated. It's not something we added on top anymore. And then there's use schema. So before you would import the schema as a part, but now it's a hook. And the really good thing about that is that it's context-based. So you can have, in theory, like two document editors using like different schemas entirely in the same time, for example. So it's just really good way to isolate the schema and the UI. And then, yeah, in this case, we're also using the use form value, which is a new hook in the form API. So you can subscribe to any value in the form using a path. So that's an example of something that replaces with document higher order component that we used to have. This is one of the, I think, alpha members in the API. So if you hover use form value, you will see that it's like alpha stage. But yeah, please give us feedback on this. Next slide. Yeah, and documentation is getting a big upgrade as well. The current documentation that lives on sanity.io/docs will continue to be there for a while, but we have this new thing called Sanity Docs Beta. And one of the things that we're doing there is to extract API references straight from the source code. So we're using a tool called API Extractor. But then we're converting the result of that to portable text, actually, that we then push to our docs backend. And we use just standard sort of Sanity tools to render that. And this requires us to write better TS docs in our source code. And that, again, sort of is really helpful for people in IDEs. So you can quickly inspect like members from the APIs and see what they're doing. And then you see the same content on the website, on the docs website. Yeah, and anytime in the future that we maybe add new properties to things, or I don't know, add some fixes, these things will be automatically pushed to the docs website. So in the future, there will not be like missing documentation. It's really hard to keep track of everything that changes and update the docs, but now we don't have to do that anymore. So you can go to beta.sanity.io and check out the new docs. Yeah, this is sort of somewhat related, I guess. We have done some changes in how we build our packages. So we're now building using Rollup. But the important thing there is that it's not so easy to import any kind of internal function or component or something, which might not sound great for everybody. But yeah, usually what happened before was that if you digged deep in the code, you could find like internal things if you used like /lib something. And the problem with that is that those things were things that we considered internals, and we changed them without thinking that we were breaking APIs, but it would break for some people who depended on these. So the good thing about not exposing them is that every upgrade of the studio will sort of be safe for an implementer or a consumer. But yeah, but this means that we have to expose more public members, which is a good thing. So please tell us if there are things that you're looking for that is not available to you in the APIs, so we can make it happen. Yeah. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, I sort of already talked about this, but yeah, we're also tagging API members with like a release tag. So the TS-doc release tag it's alpha, beta, and public. So you can like inspect and see the stability of API members, basically. Yeah. And there's one more thing, which Knut, I think, already spoiled earlier today. But anyway, here it goes. We have dark mode. And dark mode is kind of a funny little feature that might not seem so important for some, but it is actually super important for a lot of people. So I'm really happy to be able to ship this. Actually, Sanity UI has supported light and dark modes for a while, but the old theming system in V2 that was based on Post CSS didn't really work with Sanity UI. But we got rid of the old Post CSS, and now the theming works as it should. So we have a dark mode. Hope you like it.
Yeah, that's basically what we have. You can go and try it out if you want, and we hope you do, and give us some feedback. I think Knut and some other people from our lovely developer relations team will talk about how we want to get that feedback. I'm sure there's going to be lots of opinions and ideas and requests, so I can't wait to hear that. But this is the gist of it. NPM creates. Oh, there we go.
I'll put it back, yeah.
NPM creates Sanity at dev preview. Well, that should get you started.
Yeah, perfect. A lot to take in. I hope everyone is not so floored, and we can all kind of absorb this together. But thank you so much for presenting this. I'll take this down. I don't know if anyone needs this command still, but I'm going to take it down. So yeah, thank you so much. There were a couple questions. One question from me: was the npm install Sanity the easiest naming you've ever had to do in your developer career?
Yes, definitely. I'm very happy to have that be the main module for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So there were a couple of questions that came in that were kind of answered throughout by others, or maybe it was covered, but I just want to ask maybe here that you can answer. So how much of the API/syntax changed? Would it make older tutorials harder to follow for beginners who wish to adopt V3?
Good question. Parts of it is very similar. So the schema definitions, for instance, is basically this. Well, it is the same as it was, except you have a function now called define type, which helps you with TypeScript definitions, but it doesn't really do anything like magic under the hood. So that's just for improved developer experience. Well, other things will be a bit different because we are we have to replace this part system that we talked about. And so I'm sure there will be references to some parts and documentation around the web that will have to change. And we will have to provide things like React hooks instead of using sort of these global imports.
Yeah. Cool. And then another question, how does V3 improve or change localization, if it does?
We don't currently have any changes in terms of localization. That's probably coming down the line at some point. I'm sure we'll announce something around that when it happens.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for presenting all of that, and very excited to see V3 being used in the wild with all these projects that are coming, past projects and future projects. But yeah, thank you so much for joining and for presenting, and we will see you all around. And if you want to find Espen, Marius, or Bjørge, definitely they are in the Slack community that is slack.sanity.io. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.